Hello. Welcome back for another Margarita with Michael. Last episode, talked about the gospel, and I briefly addressed how faith as a concept is one that is closely tied to gospel as a concept. So I thought I'd unpack that a little bit more in this one. As I've been talking about political theology and how Christians do not have to look outside of their faith in Christ in order to find something political. So, in other words, political theology is not the intersection of the sacred with the secular, or faith with the public sphere, or something like that. There's already something public or political about our faith. And so in this episode, I thought I'd unpack that a little bit more about the politics of faith. So, I think there has been a lot of distraction in the previous 2 centuries or so regarding the way that we understand faith. We can look at this semantically, meaning the way that a word is used in human language. So we can look at it that way. We can look at the way the word faith has been expressed down through the centuries, and then how it kind of took a little bit of a turn in the previous 2 centuries or so. So that's one thing that we could look at. There's another thing that we could look at, which is the kind of challenge that many particularly conservative Christians feel regarding faith and science. And so there are, there's an alternative to religion that is able to account for the world without a deity, so atheism. And people don't really like that, and they feel threatened by that. The thing is, though, that whichever way we want to come at the issue, at the bottom line, here's the claim that I want to make. That regardless of how we understand faith and belief, or even religion, and these kinds of ideas, and regardless of how on another side someone might strip themselves of religiosity and faith and be agnostic or atheistic in their worldview, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because faith is rendering devotion, and that is inescapable with being human. So when we look at the way that faith is used just in the Bible, so we'll skip like the historical study of how faith has functioned in human language and whatnot, and we'll just go to the Bible. So faith is used in a variety of ways. So it can mean just mental assent to an idea. Even the statement Jesus Christ is Lord requires that I agree, or I believe what is being said, that there is a man named Jesus, that he is the Son of David, the Christ, and that through his coming and dying and rising and ascension, he he has been enthroned as Lord. So that's a belief that I have. There's also a really interesting thing where both in the Hebrew Bible, or what oftentimes Christians call the Old Testament, there is not a distinction between faith and faithfulness. Same thing in the New Testament. There is, it's one word, pistis is the Greek word. And then the same thing in Latin, so the language of the Roman Empire, fides, where it's one word that can mean both belief, faith, and devotion, allegiance, faithfulness. So, are we talking about when someone is, I guess a good example is this. So in Romans it says, Romans 1:16, the just shall live by faith. He's quoting Habakkuk in that passage in Romans. And the more natural way to translate it in Habakkuk, at least I think, is the faithful one shall be justified or made righteous or seen to be righteous. So which is it? Is it the faithful one, the one who keeps the Torah, the one who keeps God's law? Or is it the one who has faith, who agrees with the truth of that's being claimed in the gospel? Which is it that justifies? And the answer is both. So there is no such thing as actually there is such a thing as a belief that brings forth no response in our lives. It's the kind of faith that demons have, that James talks about. So that even the demons believe. So there's nothing special about you, Mr. Fancy Pants, when you say, yes, I believe all these things. Great, cool. You're just like the demons. But does your life show it? So what James is trying to get at is that faith ought to have an agreement between the mind and the body. The way that we live our lives is to agree with what the confession that we assent to, that we agree to, that Jesus Christ is Lord. And a term that I really, really like, that I think captures this notion of the agreement, is allegiance. So, this is a very useful term that has not evolved over time, but rather there is continuity in its use throughout history, where allegiance is something that impinges on our life. And my favorite thing about it, it's unilateral, meaning you can't be allegiant to two things equally. So, for instance, there's a sense in, I'll make this argument. There's a sense in which dual citizenship doesn't actually exist. Right? I know it exists, sort of, sometimes, with countries who are on favorable terms with one another, okay? But once there is animosity between two nations, a great example is Cold War era in the United States and Russia. I mean, it is ridiculous to think that dual citizenship would have been granted to anyone who was a Russian living in America or an American living in Russia. They would say, no, pick one. You can either be a Russian citizen or American citizen, but not both, right? So that's the thing about allegiance, is that like marriage, it's something that we give to one single person, and it does not cannot be split equally between multiple people or entities. So that's another great example. I think what I'm kind of circling back to is that faith is yet another example of a notion central to the life of the church, the life of every Christian, that is not, I guess, abstracted from the political and therefore needing to intersect with it in some way. Rather, it is something that already has a political nature, and it's something that has been singularly and unilaterally given to Christ. And that, the way that faith exists, is going to, again, impinge and push in on every domain of our lives. So whether it's our family life or our work life or the way that we show up in politics, being a Christian means something, and it's going to force itself in on our lives no matter how much we try to domesticate it, or no matter how much the principalities and powers try to domesticate it. Thanks again. This has been Margaritas with Michael.